Now that we have all that background and prefatory material under our belt, we can turn our attention to Descartes' meditations. And we'll look at meditations 1 and 2 to finish out this lecture. So in the first meditation, Descartes articulates and executes his negative epistemic project, tearing down his knowledge edifice through this vehicle of formulating different arguments to establish in this external world skepticism. So we'll start by articulating his principle of assent, which contemporary epistemologists would think of as a principle of justification. We'll see how he uses that principle to formulate a classical skeptical argument, the argument from illusion. He'll reject that argument as not being enough, and he'll formulate a second argument, the dreaming argument, again finding it to be inadequate to his needs. But then ultimately he'll end on what he calls the evil demon argument, what people call the evil demon argument. And this argument, he thinks, is sufficient to establish a complete external world skepticism. And that will be how he ends the first meditation. In the second meditation, he begins that positive epistemic project. He wants to recreate his worldview from scratch within his epistemic framework. And so we'll look at his first element, that first piece in that epistemic framework, the argument for it, cogito ergo sum, loosely translated as I think or I perceive, therefore I am. Then we'll go on to see how he makes an inference from the cogito to the existence and nature of mental substance. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about his preliminary conclusions about knowledge regarding the external world. So in his negative project, he wants to tear down his knowledge edifice. And he's going to do this by using external world skepticism. And he does this in a way that is also a contribution, a refinement of that argument. And he does so by noting this foundational nature of his judgments, his knowledge. And so he'll say, look, all of my judgments about the external world, they're all based on these foundational empirical judgments, these basic experiential judgments. Specifically, I can undermine the epistemic status of every element of my knowledge edifice simply by undermining those basic experiential beliefs, since everything else gains its epistemic status through those basic experiential beliefs. And so he's going to introduce a standard for assent, or what a contemporary epistemologist might call a theory of justification. And that is a principle that says, look, if you meet these things, then you can assent to this. If you don't meet these, then you can't. And he wants to argue that these basic experiential beliefs, they don't meet this standard for assent, hence they don't have the epistemic status necessary to support his knowledge edifice. So what is that principle of assent? Well, Descartes tells us in the second paragraph of the first Meditations. I ought to withhold my assent just as carefully from what is not obviously certain and indubitable as from what is obviously false. I can justify my rejection of my beliefs if I can find some ground for doubt in each. So he says, look, I'm going to go to these basic empirical judgments, and then I'm going to see if I can't come up with a story that leads me to have a doubt, some ground for doubt regarding each of these beliefs. So Descartes tells us what his principle of assent is in that second paragraph of the first Meditations. I ought to withhold my assent just as carefully from what is not obviously certain and indubitable as from what is obviously false. I can justify my rejection of my beliefs if I can find some ground for doubt in each. So it's a really strict principle. If I can doubt something, I should reject it as if it were false. And so he's going to use that principle to try and call those experiential beliefs into question in the same way that the ancient Greeks used the argument from illusion to draw skeptical conclusions at that time. So he says, all that I have up to this moment accepted as possessed of the highest truth and certainty, I received either from or through the senses. I observed, however, that these sometimes misled us, and that it is part of prudence not to place absolute confidence in that by which we have even once been deceived. So the idea is fairly straightforward. If I can sow a seed of doubt about my individual sensory experiences, then I should reject them as if they're false. That's my principle of assent. And in fact, when I reflect upon my sensory experiences, I realize that sometimes they aren't vertical, they aren't completely accurate. So for instance, when we think about vision, if we look at this bottom picture here, it looks like it's got all this squiggling, squirming movement in it, but in fact, it's just a stagnant, solid, unchanging picture. This gymnast here seems to have a foot for a head, but of course she doesn't. This guy seems to have no head at all, but of course he does. This gentleman is so large that he's capable of kicking over the Leaning Tower of Pisa. This cat has an incredibly long and flexible neck. And this woman is so large that she can kiss the Sphinx on the lips. And of course, all of these are misperceptions. They're illusions created by perspective or other features of visual processing, and they mislead us about the objects that we're seeing. I'll close this lecture module with a video that gives us an auditory illusion, an auditory illustration of the same point.
Many of us have become quick to catch illusions that trick our eyes, but how often do you consider illusions of the ear? Are you really able to trust your ears and the things they hear? For example, listen to Greg speaking.
Bar, 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 bar.
What do you hear? If you heard bar, 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 you'd be right. But how about now?
Bar, 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 bar.
Chances are you heard far, far, far this time with an F, except you didn't. In fact, the audio didn't even change between the two videos.
Bar, bar, bar.
Strange as it may seem, what you hear depends on which video you're looking at. Go ahead, take turns watching each video and see how the sound morphs.
Bar, bar, bar.
This is a perfect example of something called the McGurk effect, which shows how our visuals can alter what we believe we're hearing. Now I want you to count how many times you see a circle flash on screen. Let's do that one more time. Did you see it flash twice? Many people do, yet without the sound, it becomes clear that the circle is only flashing once. In this case, the sound has altered your perceived vision. The next one works best with other people around. I'll play two tones and you tell me if they're ascending or descending. In other words, are the notes played from low to high or high to low? Listen to this. Which was it? How about this one? Write down what you heard for each number and let us know in the comments. Chances are, if you compare with enough people, you'll all have different answers. Surprising? Try some more. And this one. How is it possible that you're hearing something different from others? It's an auditory illusion called the tritone paradox. It's created in such a way that the tones contain both a higher and lower frequency in them, but our brains have a preference of which to listen to. Diana Deutsch, the creator of this illusion, found that your geography and language from infancy all play a role in deciding this preference. Finally, listen to this audio clip of a gradually climbing tune. And yet, if I play the exact same clip back to you, it will sound like it's only continuing to climb higher and higher. I swear this is the exact same clip I just played. You can rewind that section of this video over and over and check for yourself. Try it. Each time you start it over, the tune is seemingly climbing even higher. It's called the shepherd tone illusion, of which there are many variations. In it, multiple sine waves are played on top of one another, raising in pitch, while one quickly drops down an octave as the others continue rising. But our brain doesn't notice this drop, and so the clips sound like they're rising forever.